Okay, good day. Welcome to the Institute of Critical Study of Society Sunday morning program of 27 June 2021. My name is Raj Sahai, who along with Jean Rule and 6 other members of the program committee organize our programs. The Institute for Critical Study of Society, ICSS Marx, was founded in 2004 at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland to preserve Marx's heritage as well as to support struggles for social justice, racial and gender equality, and for socialism, which must lead towards communism, our ultimate goal. Now, just a little bit background onto the talk. Israel was founded in 1948 over the opposition of the Palestinians, Arab countries, and India. The European Jews who came to Israel organized a terror campaign to drive out the majority Palestinians from their homes, splitting it into Gaza and West Bank, separated by Jewish settler majority Israel, which took for itself over half the land. Over 700,000 Palestinians, roughly half the population, ended up in refugee camps in the West Bank and Jordan. Several Arab-Israel wars have been fought since 1948, founding of Israel, but Israel in the Six-Day War gained more territory and has since become an unsinkable, quote unquote, unsinkable ally of the US. Wars of 1973 with Egypt and Lebanon in 82, 2006 followed. And then, since then, Israel has expanded Jewish settlements in the West Bank, while West Bank continues to be ruled by the PLO, which now is quite passive. In Gaza, a small seaside territory, intense with a large population in a very small area, is ruled by Hamas since 2005. That has resisted Israel's aggressive overlordship. Israel has launched repeated attacks on Gaza and every time killed from dozens to hundreds of civilians and destroyed the economic infrastructure on the narrowest of pretexts, every time supported by the US president and the US Congress, both houses, under the pretext of Israel's right of self-defense, as Biden has now done in the most recent case. Gaza Palestinians have been betrayed even by the human rights organizations and the UN Agency for Human Rights and by Secretary General. So these people really are like the Jews in some ways of late 1930s, early 40s. I would not have known about all this, but for one person who has so tenaciously and painstakingly researched and exposed the truth. Norman Finkelstein, who is guest today, is son of 2 Nazi concentration camp survivors. Norman obtained his doctorate degree from Princeton University and was already the author of 12 highly acclaimed scholarly books when he was denied tenure at DePaul University by the efforts of Israel lobby, whose prominent point person in this was Alan Dershowitz of Harvard. Norman has now written 14 books to his credit, including his latest I Accuse, published, I think he said 2 years ago. And this publication, Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom, which I just finished reading. His first book was published in '87, From the Jewish Question to the Jewish State, an essay on the theory of Zionism, which was his doctoral thesis at Princeton. The opinions expressed in our lectures, workshops, and publications are only those of its authors. We are united, however, in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, who in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach said, philosophers have explained the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. I think of no one who exemplifies this statement of Marx than Norman Finkelstein. Norman has elected to be brief in his talk today, as he has already spoken, he said, over 25 forums in the last month, so he feels it's better if we had a dialogue with him, otherwise he'll be repeating himself. After his talk, We will have, as usual, a brief intermission, and maybe we'll postpone that intermission because he has a limited time of an hour and 15 minutes. So I think we want to use his time as best as we can. So his talk will be followed by questions and comments. So please join me in welcoming our guest, a person of deep humanity, intellectual integrity, a great scholar, and a great fighter for social justice, Norman Finkelstein. Thank you.
Should I begin?
Yes, please, Norman.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. There were some tiny errors in the introduction, nothing significant, except I do not like to have my credentials artificially boosted. So I would say I've written 6 or 7 discrete books, which are, I would say, they're competent pieces of scholarship. There are some areas of overlap in what I've written. So I want to set the record straight. One book I wrote, which I kind of like, it's a little book, very little book, but I think its original is on Gandhi, what Gandhi really said about nonviolence, resistance, and courage. Gandhi was an interesting figure for many reasons. The one that surprised me reading him or discovering him was that his collected works come to about 110 500-page volumes. And my impression is virtually nobody has read them. When I first started to check out Gandhi's volumes at New York University, which is a first-tier research university, aside from, they acquired the volumes in the 1980s. And apart from one volume, they were virgin territory. You turn to the back where it indicates with the stamp how many times the books were checked out. Of the 110 volumes, only one volume was checked out. And I have a feeling I know why that one volume was checked out. It was from 1940. And I suspect the person who checked it out was curious what Gandhi had to say about the Nazi Holocaust. So we're enough, that's my suspicion. So apart from that, it was virgin territory. And I found him quite interesting enough that I wanted to set out his doctrine on nonviolence, what actually he meant by it. It's a very complex idea, how he envisaged nonviolence, at whom he was directing the nonviolence, who was, so to speak, his audience, and what he meant by violence and nonviolence. These things are much more subtle, much more nuanced than one might suppose. So I sat down and wrote a little book on it, and I still am satisfied with it. It's only around 100 pages, but basically it synthesizes his doctrine as I came to understand it from reading 47 of the 110 volumes. I started at 1930, assuming that the mature Gandhi would be the more interesting Gandhi to look at. Now, that's just a side note. Now to the matter at hand. What I want to limit myself to in my introductory remarks is what changed between May 10th and May 20th, 2021 already, 2021, what changed as a result of Israel's latest murderous assault on Gaza. And in fact, quite a lot changed. I wouldn't want to use the expression that things changed overnight. I would rather say things reached a critical mass, a turning point during Israel's latest assault. And the assault itself lit up an accumulating reality. There had been incremental changes, they accumulated, and then that reality lit up during the Israeli assault. Some of you might know that when the Kronstadt rebellion occurred in 1920, I think, in then Russia, Lenin, I think it was, who said that the rebellion lit up a reality that they had hitherto, either willfully or unwillfully, they had hitherto not acknowledged. And I think the same kind of metaphor can be used for what Israel called Operation Guardian of the Walls. I hate using the Israeli titles because they're so juvenile, they're so stupid, but I don't think yet, I could be wrong, I don't think the Gazans have given that operation a title, so I will use the Israeli nomenclature. So let me try now in bullet form to indicate the changes I think occurred, and then you can probe me on my bullet point exposition or on other matters, other aspects of the current reality. The one aspect I'm going to comment on least is the military aspect, because I don't want to pretend to be a military strategist, a military combatant, or knowledgeable in military matters in general. However, I would be remiss if I ignored the military reality, because significant things did happen. There's just no getting around that fact. Israel became the US, what came to be called strategic asset after the June 1967 war, when it inflicted a military defeat on an array of Arab armies, beginning with what was reputed to be the most formidable military force in the region, namely Egypt. Now, I don't want to go through the details of that reality because they're more complicated than one might suppose. However, the fact of the matter is, the bottom line is, Israel inflicted a massive and humiliating defeat on the Arab world, which then catapulted it very high on the US agenda in the Middle East, because now it became the regional gendarme, what was called, although earlier, the stationary aircraft carrier of the United States in that region. Now, fast forward many wars, many problematic Israeli military showings. Fast forward to May 2021, Gaza is a postage stamp. Gaza is in length its smaller in length than a marathon. A marathon is 26.2 miles. Gaza is 25 miles. In width, if you take the main park in New York, it's called Central Park. It's our little treasure. In width, Gaza is 2 central parks. So you have 2 central parks by less than a marathon. That's Gaza. Gaza has been under a brutal, illegal siege for the past 15 years, since 2006. That means it's virtually impossible for anything to get in, any goods to get in and get out, as well as people to get in and get out without Israeli approval. And under the terms of the blockade of Gaza, not only are goods which can have a direct application in military affairs, not only are goods which can have a direct impact, but what are called dual use goods are also prohibited. For all intents and purposes, that means it's well near impossible for Gaza to acquire anything approaching a military arsenal. And then there's the fact that Gaza its population is more than 1/2 children. It's about 53% of Gaza is under the age of 18. And to cut to the chase, Israel was unable to inflict a military defeat on Gaza in the course of those 10 days, and it was forced to sign a ceasefire before it managed to curtail the Hamas projectile attacks. It was forced to sign that ceasefire because the Israeli military genuinely feared, in fact, it dreaded the prospect of invading Gaza, and in the course of that invasion, incurring significant military casualties. I don't want to go into all the aspects of the military side, first of all, because I said my lack of complete competence in that area. Secondly, because the facts still have not yet been verified in critical domains. However, I think the most revealing fact of the Israeli attack in May was that Israel no longer possesses a fighting army. Now, let me be clear on what I'm saying here. I don't want to be misconstrued. Israel obviously has a cutting-edge technological military force. Technologically, it's cutting edge, very sophisticated. I'm not knowledgeable in those areas, but I have no doubt about its degree of technological sophistication. But the general, I think the consensus the consensus among experts is you can't win a war with an air force or with missiles or with the most sophisticated technology. At some point, there has to be a ground invasion. And Israel has become a westernized society. You could say Israel has become a kind of secular, egotistical society, like most Western societies. And for better or for worse, I won't pass judgment. For sure, I won't pass judgment. The Israelis are unwilling to pay the price in lives for fighting a war. Israel, it may not be a nice thing to say, but Israel is the most cowardly army on God's earth, bar none. It's the most cowardly army on God's earth, bar none. It fights remote control, computer game type wars in which it inflicts massive, indiscriminate death and destruction from behind a computer screen or in front of a computer screen. But when it comes to actually risking lives, which is supposed to be the valor of war, which incidentally Gandhi admired a lot. Gandhi admired a lot the physical courage attendant upon war. He wrote several things about the Pashtuns and their sheer physical courage, which he was a great admirer of. In any event, that kind of physical courage, and as I said, I want to be clear, I'm not passing judgment, I'm simply establishing a fact. That's gone. The Israelis will not give their lives to fight in Gaza. They won't give their lives to fight in Lebanon. Now, I do think it's a question mark whether, if in fact Israel ever faced an existential threat, that is to say, the country itself being overrun, whether the army would summon the courage to fight. My guess is yes, but I can't prove that. I know that the head of the Hezbollah, Syed Nasrallah, he says no. He says that now that Israel has proven that it's incapable of providing physical security for its citizens, that the citizens will willy-nilly leave Israel. I'm a little bit skeptical on that score, but I am not in doubt that Israelis won't fight. I shouldn't say they will fight wars, but were remote control wars. What they won't do is risk their lives in Gaza or elsewhere. So the bottom line is Israel is no longer, unfortunately, one second, I'm going to close the windows. Give me 1 second. So Israel is no longer a fighting army. Now, there's a lot of illusions about the nature of its army, even in 67. But we can say, let's say during the 1948 war, there were about 600,000 Jews in Palestine. Of those 600,000, 6,000 were killed during what Israel calls its War of Independence. So that's 1% of the population, which is a significant number, obviously. If it were the United States, 1% would be 30,000 people or more, 35,000 people. So it was a significant number. But now Israel won't even incur casualties in the double digits before it panics or looks upon with dread the prospect of a war. That's the military side. Let's now turn to the political side. The most significant development actually occurred just before the Israeli assault on Gaza in May, and that is the publication of two critical reports. One by the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, which is the main Israeli human rights organization monitoring the occupied Palestinian territories, and the second by Human Rights Watch. The Human Rights Watch was very substantial. It was a report called A Threshold Crossed, and it numbered 210 pages with a very substantial scholarly apparatus. These two reports crossed several red lines, Israeli red lines. Number one, they both declared for all, in effect, they both declared Israel as a racist state. Human Rights Watch described Israel as a state built upon the principle of Jewish domination. B'Tselem stated that Israel is built on the principle of Jewish supremacy. So whether you call, now I should be clear about one critical point. These descriptions of Israel as based on Jewish domination, based on Jewish supremacy, are inclusive of Israel itself. The reports in those descriptors were not just referring to the occupied Palestinian territories. They were referring not just to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. They were referring to, so to speak, Israel proper. So, for the first time, major human rights organizations did not limit their critique only to the occupied Palestinian territories. They focused on the whole area from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, and they in effect declared that entire area, inclusive of the state of Israel, is a racist state. In addition, the Human Rights Watch report stated that in the occupied Palestinian territories, Israel had created an apartheid, practices apartheid. The B'Tselem report stated the whole area, not just the occupied Palestinian territories, the whole area from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, inclusive of the state of Israel. B'Tselem said the whole area is an apartheid regime. So two red lines had been crossed. Red line number one, the criticism emanating from human rights organizations were no longer limited to the occupied Palestinian territories. Number two, the human rights organizations have now adopted and appropriated the language of apartheid to describe the Israeli regime, either in the occupied Palestinian territories or in the area as a whole. Now, those developments immediately preceded the Israeli assault. The second major development came to light as a result of the Israeli assault. The assault didn't cause the next development. The assault revealed the new development. And that is, there was clearly a radical shift in public opinion in the United States regarding Israel. I'll just indicate a few aspects of that shift. Aspect number one, there were no mass mobilizations in support of Israel anywhere in the United States. In the past, in my own city in New York, if Israel was coming under, say, attack by rockets or missiles, you would have an emergency mobilization within a couple of days that would bring out literally, not hyperbole, literally 1 million overwhelmingly Jews to Fifth Avenue in Brooklyn, Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And you would have every politician, from the local representative to the mayor, to the governor, to the senators, the US senators, they would all show up at this demonstration with vigorous, fervent words of support and solidarity with beleaguered Israel. This time in New York, there were two tiny demonstrations. Tiny demonstrations. No politician showed up. No words of solidarity. In fact, Israel's biggest supporters in Congress, Charles Schumer, Gerald Nadler, Bob Menendez, the senator from New Jersey, the most powerful figures in our Congress, Senator Charles Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, not a peep. Not a peep. He used to pride himself. There's a word in Hebrew, a shomer. A shomer is a watchman, the watchman. And Schumer used to say, my name, Schumer, comes from Shomer. And I'm Israel's watchman. That's what he has said. And he used to be so virulent in his support for Israel and hatred of Arabs, Palestinians in particular. This time, he was silent. Ditto Nadler and Menendez. Nobody of prominence was willing to go out on the limb for Israel. On the other hand, the demonstrations numbered in the tens of thousands in New York in support of the Palestinians. Tens of thousands. I attended one of them, or two of them, one. And it was like a Black Lives Matter demonstration. It was almost entirely 20-somethings. It was as heterogeneous, spirited, as the Black Lives Matter demonstrations during the George Floyd upsurge. So the tables had turned. When I first started out, the supporters of Palestinian would number about 300 at best. You get a demonstration of 300 at best. Supporters of Israel, about 1 million, typically. And now the ratio had reversed. There was talk in Congress about what happened, but the talk was critical of Israel. It was by what's come to be called the Squad. And they were openly, aggressively attacking Israel for its murderous assault on Gaza and its land theft in East Jerusalem. So that was a major development. As to what accounts for it, I'll save that for questions if people are curious. So I would say the main points I would want to make and have made are the military aspect, the political aspect, and the public opinion aspect of the attack. And that just leaves us, where do we go from here? And I'll hold off on that for questions and answers. I don't hear you. I don't hear you.
Hear me?
Now you're okay. We hear you now, Raj.
Yeah,
Go
got
ahead.
headphones on and that blocked the speaker. Okay, my microphone. Okay, thank you, Norman. And so we open up, and I first want to go to Richard Wright. He wants to say something. Richard, can you please limit it because time is kind of tight with Norman. So I will go with him first.
No. It wouldn't be appropriate at this point.
Okay. All right. So you have any question then, Richard?
You have a question, but I don't mind
give
getting
you.
on.
I'll
Okay.
give you the first one.
Okay. A quick question. Norman, you suggested that that land forces are becoming less. I'm not sure effective is the right word here, but less used. And Israel, like the United States, is relying more and more on Air Force. My question is, do you see that changing? So far, it seems to me that the military effectiveness of the Air Force or air power is in large measure because there's been very little air defense. And so my question is, do you see that changing if air defense becomes more important? Thank you.
I have to always qualify anything I say with the caveat that I'm not an expert in military history or military matters, so I can't speak with any kind of authority. What seems to be clear is that the Hezbollah first and now Hamas has adopted a strategy which Israel is unable to cope with. The strategy is basically to fire these projectiles at Israel. In the case of Hamas, they really don't amount to more in most cases, overwhelmingly, they don't amount to more than fireworks. However, these projectiles cannot be taken out by air. The only way to take them out is through a land invasion. And so what happens over and over again is first in Lebanon in 2006, and then repeatedly in Gaza, is they goad, G-O-A-D, they goad the Israelis with these projectiles, forcing Israel to reach a decision whether we're going to launch the ground invasion in order to take out the projectiles. And Israel, after 2014, when it did launch the ground invasion, but suffered 66 casualties, which for Israel is a lot. When you're accustomed to a casualty-free war, what you might call a deluxe war, played like PlayStation, then 66 casualties is a lot. And just like in Lebanon in 2006, the troops gathered on the border in 2006. The war lasted 34 days. The invasion occurs in the last 72 hours. And the whole purpose of the invasion was a photo op. The troops rushed through southern Lebanon to the Litani, got photographed at the Litani, and then the war was over. And this time, the troops hovered along the border with Gaza, but ultimately, Prime Minister Netanyahu decided against the invasion because he knew it would likely be, from the calculus of Israel, it would be too costly in dead soldiers.
Okay, so I'll go to the next question. I'm not necessarily going in sequence. There's 7 hands up. I'll get to everybody. So the next person I'll go to is to Marilyn. Marilyn, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Finkelstein. I really appreciate your work over the years. My question is this: in an earlier presentation about the same topic, I heard you mention that in order for an organization like Human Rights Watch to actually shift their narrative and use terms like Jewish domination and apartheid, it must be okay at some level with their funders. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think is the current agenda of the types of people who fund, the very wealthy who fund organizations like Human Rights Watch, and what is that? How does that fit in with U.S. Policy and towards Israel and U.S.'s relationship to Israel going forward?
I think the large sector of liberal Jewish public opinion has, I'll use a phrase of Phil Weiss, who edits Mondo Weiss. He used the expression, which wasn't a bad expression. He said they have checked out of Hotel Zion. And I think there's a certain amount of, more than a certain amount of truth to that. What happened was there are many aspects why there has been a mass exodus among liberal Jews from Hotel Zion. But I think the principal explanation is those 4 years of Mr. Trump, who was simultaneously the bogey of the liberal democratic constituency of the Democratic Party, the types that read the New York Times, listen to NPR, and watch MSNBC. So Mr. Trump was the bogey of the liberal democratic constituency of the Democratic Party. And at the same time, he was Israel's strongest ally, and he was more popular among Jews in Israel than in any other country in the world, its population. I think the percentage was something like 77% of Israeli Jews had a positive opinion of Donald Trump. And so now American Jews were faced with a kind of schizophrenia. The very person they have been weaned to hate, namely Mr. Trump, is also the most popular figure in the Jewish state. And so the amount of support for Israel began to precipitously drop during those 4 years of Trump. And therefore, the human rights organizations, the donor base of which is very wealthy American Jews, now felt confident it could write more aggressively regarding Israel and not lose its donor base.
Okay. So next person I'll ask is Mark Albertson, followed by Beto Bretta Pine, then Rick Baum, and then I'll pick the next 3. Please go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Raj. Good afternoon, Mr. Finkelstein. Yeah, my name.
I don't hear you. I do not hear you.
Okay.
I accidentally muted him. My fault.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. Mr. Finkelstein, my name is Mark Albertson. I'm the historical research editor at Army Aviation Magazine in Monroe, Connecticut. And going back to what you mentioned earlier about Israel becoming a strategic asset for the United States after the '67 war, I am in the midst right now, because I'm writing a history of Army aviation in covering that period when the United States was losing the Vietnam War and we're getting out. The war that's really important as well was the '73 war, because the United States is going to have to reacclimate the Army to fighting a conventional style of war as opposed to counterinsurgency in Southeast Asia. And what really resonated with them was the increase in sophistication of Soviet ground-to-air missiles against aircraft, because for the first time, the Syrians and the Egyptians took a number of Israeli aircraft. This is what really concerned the United States, because they're going to have to acclimate the Army to the mass of the Soviet tank armies in Europe. So they forged a close relationship with the Israeli high command. And so the Israelis, as a part of this, are going to really begin to buy Cobra attack helicopters. And so the United States at the same time, General Dupuy, Don Starry, have opened up a close relationship at this point. I'm talking 73, 75, 77, 79. And they're both learning on the same plane here on how to confront not just Egyptian and Syrian tank armies, but the Soviet tank armies in Europe. Why? Because the Egyptians and Syrians are using Soviet equipment. And you saw the fruits of this in Desert Storm in 1991. If you have any rebuttal, I'd be glad to listen.
No, because I'm completely lacking in knowledge of that subject. So
Well, it's a fascinating progression here between the United States and the Israelis in the 1970s and 1980s.
Okay, so thank you. We'll go to Beda Brita Pine. Please go ahead, Bedo.
Hi, Raj. Thank you for recognizing me, Professor Finkelstein. It was really fantastic hearing you. As always, I'm reading your books. It's always fascinating. I had one very quick question. It's kind of a follow-up from what Marilyn was talking about. You talked about the change in attitude of the Jews in America, but I wanted to hear more about American political establishment in geopolitical terms. Is there a change, or has there been a change? Has there been a shift towards the Middle East, towards Israel, especially in the 21st century?
there were some subterranean changes with the Biden administration. Publicly, Biden went in default. We support Israel's right of self-defense and all the other bromides that we're familiar with every time Israel launches one of its massacres against Gaza. However, there were some differences, subterranean, behind the scenes, behind closed doors, but you could see the, so to speak, messaging to Israel was different. For example, when Israel destroyed the high-rise building in which AP, Associated Press, was housed, they claimed that there was a Hamas command and control center in the building. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was asked at a press conference whether he had seen evidence to support the Israeli claim. And he very pointedly said, I haven't seen any evidence. Maybe there's some evidence, he said, maybe there is. I've not seen any. And that was a very critical moment because Blinken was signaling to the Israelis, you do what you want, but we're not going to bail you out. We're not going to lie for you. You're not taking us down with you this time. You're on your own. You want to commit, murder and mayhem? Well, we'll let you commit it up to a point, was the US message. Because at that moment, they were already fighting off in the Security Council 14 other members who wanted to issue a resolution, and the US was holding them off. And so the message to the US, the message from the US to Israel was, so long as you keep the destruction within certain bounds, i.e., you don't commit any large-scale war crimes, so long as you keep it within bounds, we'll hold off the other 14 members of the Security Council. However, if you cross the red line and you commit a large-scale massacre, we're going to sign on to the resolution. So for an Israeli assault, remember the qualifier for an Israeli assault, it was rather small. Remember, 200 people were killed, about 200 people were killed. During the first day, the very first day of Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, Israel attacked a graduation ceremony of police, civil police. The very first day, killed in 3 minutes, it killed 200 to 300 Palestinians at a graduation ceremony. So this time it was in 10 days, about 200 casualties. So there was all sorts of messaging by the US government, the US administration, which was different than in the past, in my opinion.
Thank you.
How are we doing for time? Can you tell me what time it is?
It's 11:28 my time. So
Okay.
1:28.
15 more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so the next person is Rick Baum, followed by Amit Singh, and then Yusuf. And Gene had raised his hand, but I don't see him raising his hand. So let's go ahead, Rick.
Hold on for one more. I'm just going to open the windows.
Okay.
The noise stuff. Okay.
Thank you. I have probably a two-part question. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and evaluation of Hamas, and then also what your thoughts are about the rocket attacks, or what you call projectile attacks, since the media almost makes them sound equivalent to what the Israelis are doing. That's why I would like to hear what you think of their attacks. Thank you.
I don't have strong opinions about Hamas. It won the first free and fair election. Here I'm using the words of Jimmy Carter, who was an observer in January 2006 at the election. It won the first free and fair elections in the Arab world. But as in many cases, for example, most recently in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, when it won the election in 2011, they were never given a chance. Immediately as Hamas won, Israel, followed by the US, followed by the UN, imposed the harsh sanctions and medieval siege on Gaza. So I can't predict what would have happened had they been given a chance to rule. My guess would be that it would have been an uneven performance. Probably some good and some bad would have come of it, or I should say some positive and some negative things would have come of it. I would say that whatever one thinks of Hamas ideologically, it does remain a legitimate or an authentic resistance movement to the Israeli occupation, which cannot be said of the Palestinian Authority, which since 1993, the Oslo Accord, ceased to be a legitimate or authentic anti-occupation movement and became a collaborationist, quizzling type regime. As to the so-called projectiles, there's an easy way to test their lethality. During the first days of the Israeli assault on Gaza, Israel publicly stated that Iron Dome, its alleged anti-missile defense system, was malfunctioning. That's what Israel said the first few days. And then it said Iron Dome wasn't able to cope with the dense barrage of rockets emanating from Hamas, the unprecedentedly dense barrage of rockets. Israel also reported that some 400 Hamas quote unquote rockets were fired the first day, 300 something the second day, and roughly the same the third day. So now we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of supposed rockets being launched from Gaza. And yet, if you looked at the Israeli Daily Diary website, which chronicled the damage, the death and destruction wreaked by the Hamas supposed rockets, you find that barely any civilian infrastructure was damaged. Barely any. Now you can explain the fewness of Israeli civilians who were injured or killed by virtue of Israel's very effective civil defense program, which includes messaging on cell phones and all sorts of other very sophisticated technology. So that would explain how Israeli civilians were able to rush to shelters to save their persons. However, as we all know, homes do not go into shelters. Offices do not go into shelters. Buildings do not go into shelters. So how did it come to pass that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Hamas quote unquote rockets being fired into Israel? We were told into central Israel, northern Israel, the central population areas, and yet barely any physical damage. Well, to me, the explanation is plain as day. They weren't rockets. They were mostly bottle rockets, the sorts of rockets you fire on the 4th of July.
Okay. So I think we have 10 minutes remaining of his time, if I'm looking at watch correctly. So I will go with Yusuf, Amit, and Jean, next three, and that may exhaust his time unless he can extend it. So Yusuf, please go.
Okay, thank you. I remember you. I remember you from New Haven. You used to come here a lot. Now I have a feeling that the incidents over Jerusalem were meant to provoke Hamas into action. Because Hamas said if such and such red lines are crossed, it will take action, and that happened. Also, Biden he made some remarks. Well, there ought to be a ceasefire in a couple of days, and yes, there was a ceasefire a couple of days. I don't think these are coincidences, and I think they were correlated. And I want to hear your opinion.
Well, obviously, conspiracies exist. However, not every situation is the resultant of a conspiracy. In my opinion, there was a lot of speculation that Netanyahu was engaging in this kind of instigation in order to break up the opposition coalition, which included an Arab party. But I don't think, as far as I could tell, I think there was relatively little calculation in the inception. That is to say, Israelis carry on, and they really do have an Übermenschen mentality. They think these Arabs, these Palestinians, are subhuman. Every once in a while, these natives get restless, and then you have to take out the big stick, the club, and you have to smash their skull to remind them who's in charge. But they have no respect for the dignity and the personhood of Arabs in general and for Palestinians in particular. So I don't think they expected a reaction. It began with beating up, as Israel is wont to do. It began with viciously attacking the protesters in Sheikh Jarrah. Then it spread to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third most holy site in Islam. And it was during Ramadan, the Islamic holy period, and it was on the holiest night of Ramadan that the Israeli Übermenschen attacked the worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque. But I don't think they even fear the reaction. They have complete contempt for these people. I think they were genuinely surprised when Hamas kept to its word and said, either you stop this or we're going to retaliate. I think they were genuinely surprised. So, but after that, once it began, yes, of course there was political calculation by Netanyahu about how to proceed. But his major calculation was a very painful one for him. He calculated too many Israeli soldiers were going to die in an invasion, and so he signed a treaty without winning it. He signed a ceasefire, or he accepted a ceasefire without winning anything. It was just the most spectacular military catastrophe for Israel in its history. It could not defeat militarily a postage stamp sized territory.
Okay, Amit Singh is next, then Jean. And
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Finkelstein. I mean, my question is very straightforward and simple. What do you make of this recent UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and US accord? I mean, how the Arab states. So basically, you are painting a very hopeful picture that in the long run, Israel has to wrap up its politics in the region. But I'm also seeing some signs that even Arab states are showing some friendships hands with Israel. So how do you think of that?
Well, the UAE and Bahrain, they're not states. They're family-owned gas stations. So we shouldn't, in my opinion, inflate the significance of them over opening up relations with Israel. Saudi clearly was going to follow in line with the UAE and Bahrain, but ended up not doing so because Israel is, as I tried to indicate, it became that strategic asset in 1967, but now it's proving more and more doubtful as a formidable military ally. The Saudis, all they were interested in Israel was they would hope that Israel would be the army to pull their chestnuts out of the fire should there be a conflict with Iran. But that's becoming an open question. And so the Saudis must be thinking now about trying to reach some sort of modus vivendi with Iran, because Israel is not that formidable military power that it was assumed to be.
Okay, Gene?
Yes, well, thank you so much for this. This has really been illuminating, I think. I really appreciate it. I have a comment and a question. On the comment, first of all, we had a speaker a couple of weeks ago, Wadi Halabi, who is Palestinian and a communist. He was born in Yafa, I believe, in 1946, and immediately had to flee with his parents, had to flee first to Gaza, then Egypt, then finally to Connecticut and Massachusetts. But he refuses to use the term Israel. He simply calls it occupied Palestine, which has a certain logic for me. The other thing, my question is, what would be the impact if the United States simply refused to exercise its veto power on the in the Security Council and allowed an open debate and whatever action that the United Nations could take in this situation? Well, how would that change things in your view?
I don't think Israel is independent enough or autonomous enough to withstand global pressure. So if the kinds of sanctions that have been talked about with regard to Israel, where they actually implemented, I do think they probably would bring to bear a lot of pressure on Israel. I was just the other day reading former President Jimmy Carter's memoir of his term in office, Keeping Faith, and the last 50 pages or more, maybe a little more, maybe the last 100 pages, are devoted to the Iran hostage crisis. And the Iranians, right after the 1979 resolution, when they took the Americans in the embassy hostage, their demands were quite, they were significant demands. First and foremost, they demand that the Shah be returned into Iran and held, and prosecuted for his crimes. The U.S. imposed very forceful sanctions on Iran, political, economic, social sanctions. Now, it did take 54 days. No. It took, why did I say? No, it took 14 months. It did take 14 months, but by the end, the sanctions were released the last day of Carter's term of office. The demands of the Iranians were significantly diminished. They wanted the return of their assets, which had been frozen, and pretty much that was it. The sanctions did hurt Iran a lot. There's no question about that. So Israel is a country of only 8 million people. I very much doubt it could withstand significant sanctions were they imposed.
Dr. Finkelstein, there one more question from the audience, and if you have time, one question from me. So the question from the audience is from Bonnie Weiss, who's written it in the chat, is Cornel West was denied was kicked out of or pushed out of Harvard recently because of his support for Palestine, kind of like what happened to you.
No, I don't agree with that.
No?
No, I know Cornell. He actually was in graduate school at the same time as me. We both began graduate school the same time. I consider him a very bright person, no question. He can make circles around me. His knowledge is very impressive. No question in my mind about that. None. However, as Cornell likes to say, he had tenure at Harvard already. He had tenure at Princeton. He had tenure at Yale. So this would have been his second round at Harvard of tenure. That's not what happened to me. I was never able to get a job. I was adjuncting my whole adult life, which meant making between $15,000 and $25,000 a year in New York City, which was less than the McDonald's, full-time McDonald's worker. After I was denied tenure at a third-rate university, and that's generous, probably fifth-rate, DePaul University, I never worked another day in my life. So I resent it to be put in the same category as him. All regard for his intelligence, all regard for his academic pedigree, very impressive. He got his philosophy degree in 3 years from Harvard. That's an achievement. I recognize the achievement. Philosophy is a significant discipline. Harvard has a strong department. It certainly had a very strong department back then. And he got his degree in 3 years. I wholly acknowledge it. But I'm not going to accept being put in the same category as him in terms of the price paid.
No,
Now,
that wasn't the question. That wasn't the intent of the question. May I say, what he was saying is that academia is not changing while the public perception in Jewish community and the United States in general about these issues changing. So he was treated not the same as you, I agree, but he was apparently pushed out because of his support for Palestine. And so the question...
He speculates that. And I'm willing to credit his speculation, although the evidence at this point is, I think he would agree, the evidence is thin. He gives circumstantial evidence, but I would say it's thin. Look, I respect Cornell. However, I'm old enough to speak my mind and accept the consequences. I do not believe Cornell made the best use of his academic promise. I do not believe that. I think like many people, in particular minorities, he got discovered too young, and he became a jet setter when he needed to sit down in his study and produce the greatest African-American scholar of the 20th century, and perhaps ever to live, was W.E.B. Du Bois. And it was Du Bois's great good fortune. His greatest good fortune was he was never able to get a position in a respected university. So he didn't have to go to the wine and cheese parties. He didn't have to go to the stupid conferences. He ended up at the historically, what's called the HBCU, the historically Black colleges and universities. He ended up at Atlanta. He did very excellent work, I think in large part because he wasn't lured, L-U-R-E-D, he wasn't lured by the tinsel of the Ivy League. So the boys, one of the boys' greatest works was Black Reconstruction. And believe it or not, one of his best known works he wrote in his mid-60s. He was already in his mid-60s when he wrote Black Reconstruction. Now, most professors, they publish their doctoral dissertation, write one more book, which is a spin-off from their dissertation, and that's it. That's their whole academic production. Du Bois is going till the end. And I think a large part of it was, listen, discrimination, bigotry, they have, like all phenomena, they have contradictory effects. And I think it was to Du Bois's good fortune that he was discriminated against because it made him a much more productive scholar. And I think Cornell got discovered too young, in my opinion. I will never take away his achievement. When I hear him lecture, his range of knowledge is very impressive. And not just the range, the depth. There are some topics which I am knowledgeable about, which he speaks on. He does get the details right. He gets the details right. So it's not a case of a mile wide and an inch deep. No, he's a mile wide and there's depth. There's depth. But did he realize his academic promise? He says he didn't really care. He said, there are different things you can do in life. And he chose to do what he did, which is, okay, that's all well and good. But in terms of the conventional criteria of scholarship, I think he didn't achieve what he could have.
So,
I don't like it. This is how we began. I don't like it of being put in the same category. It's a very big difference between being denied tenure at Harvard and not being able to get a job in the post office because of the stance I took on Israel-Palestine. And that's literally the case. From 2007, I was not unemployed. I was unemployable. There was no job for which I could not volunteer. I tried volunteering in high schools where I knew the principals. And I could not volunteer in a high school to teach. So I don't like that grouping of me.
This was somebody's question, but if you were willing to entertain one of my questions, which is this. Now, you have taken the position that international law and civil disobedience, what Gandhi taught, is the way forward, drawing attention of the sympathy of the world's people. And I recognize his legitimacy, but posited against that is the US imperial interest of using Israel as an instrument of repression in order to be able to control strategic asset that is oil in the Middle East. Now, I may be wrong, but could you please react to that? How is it possible that Gandhian tactic could work here, and when this interest is so powerful on behalf of the United States that it will not abandon Israel so easily?
Look, India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Now, I'm not saying that civil disobedience alone accounted for the eventual independence of India. Clearly, the most basic factor was the British were bankrupt after World War II. They couldn't afford an empire any longer. And the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial movement emerged in full force after World War II. And so trying to maintain the British Empire is Britain couldn't do it any longer. So that's the principal context. But within that context, I don't think it's deniable that the Gandhi's movement played a significant role. So if it could play a significant role in dislodging the jewel in the crown of the British Empire from Great Britain, then it seems to me plausible that nonviolent civil resistance can play a significant role in freeing the Palestinians from the Israeli occupation.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. I think your time is up by your own.
Okay. Well,
The time is up. Is there time for one more question? Comment?
I really have to go because I have an.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Finkelstein. Okay, folks, now we go to our own discussion. I have to leave at 12:30 today, so after that, somebody has to become the moderator. So the first person to now go there is you. So please go ahead, Norma.
Oh.
If you have comment or question.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't get you in.
That's fine, thanks. Just thought when the world was giving the super religious, that I don't believe people believe, the super religious gave that area to the Jews, the persecuted Jews, to say the least, to suddenly the Arabs became the Nazis. I was aghast. I couldn't believe it. I just, why were the Arabs the Nazis? Now, you know, they had began to fight and protect their space because they were being attacked literally by the Jewish army, the few people that were assailing them in order, I don't know why. Well, in order to prove the ability of the Jews to come in and dominate, to come into that land. But Jews had been living together with Arabs there for a long time before the conversion of the land to the historic, what do they call the land? You know, anyway, it'll come to me. I can't remember anything anymore, it seems. So, and also, so I traveled, you know, to Israel under the idea that this land was the Jews and all that kind of thing. Of course, my husband was Catholic or came from Irish Catholic people. And my thing was not religious, it was communist. And so that's why we went, is to support the socialist attempt there, the building of a socialist state. And of course, that was proven mistaken. So we didn't stay very long. And anyway, that's what seduced us to go, was to, you know, the world is full of all this nonsense. And so this was to make some sense. We were looking for some way to do something good. So I just thought it'd be worth mentioning, you know, making the Arabs into Nazis is what I saw happening then.
Yeah, I wanted to say that before I go to Mark. Mark is the hand is raised, but I just want to make a comment that I paid a small price to stand up for the Palestinians in my career also. So, but mine was small compared to what he has gone through. And even though the intent of Bonnie Weiss's question was not to place him in the same category, was basically to say, what has changed? Why hasn't the academia got the fact that public is no longer, even Jewish public opinion in the United States is no longer willing to support Israel's aggression against the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza now. But let's go to Mark. Mark, you're next, and followed by Yusuf. And I'm here till 12:30, and I think if Jean is here, so I'll hand it over to Jean to manage it afterwards till 1 o'clock. Mark, go ahead.
I won't be managing it after 1 o'clock.
No, up to 1 o'clock, I'm saying.
After 12, I won't be managing.
Okay, well, it means moderating, okay? Moderating means giving people, kind of keeping order. How about that?
I think part of the answer to Norma's question is some of the people like Sadat, who was spying on the British for the Nazis during World War II, or Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who after the 36-39 Arab uprising in the Middle East, he went to Iraq, he went to fascist Italy, and then he wound up in Nazi Germany. He wound up actually having his own so-called radio show, and he was beaming to the Arabs. Your friends aren't the British. Your friends aren't the British. They're not the Russians. They're not the Americans. They're fascist Italy, and they're Nazi Germany. And he, by the way, is interesting from the perspective that he told Hitler in 1940 that when the Nazi armies get to Palestine, you got to exterminate all the Jewish people. So this is something that some of these people don't forget. And
Who was this guy?
Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He's an interesting character. Might not be playing with a full deck, but he's an interesting character. Yeah, he was very anti-Jewish, extremely anti-Jewish, extremely. It's fascinating. But some of these Jewish people aren't going to forget this. So what are they going to say? So some of them, what are they going to say? You know?
So I want to go with Richard, even though his hand came later, but
that's fine.
Yusuf has spoken before. So Yusuf, you go after Richard. Richard, please go ahead. Richard.
I assume you're referring to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the question was raised earlier, why the United States seemed to be abandoning its Israel as a strategic asset. And I think it goes back to the pivot to Asia, to Obama. You know, Obama made the decision, his administration, that the first priority was the war with China and Russia. And so that de-emphasized the Middle East. And that's part of the reason why the Israeli government was not so enthusiastic about the Obama administration. And conversely, Trump, as Mr. Finkelstein said, was the bogeyman because he was not so enthusiastic about the war with China and Russia, and didn't fully accept that shift in strategy. So now Biden is back on track with that thing, and the only reason Israel is not abandoned completely yet is that domestic political reasons, and I think Mr. Finkelstein shows that even that's being, you know, the public opinion is being altered so as to facilitate it, because Israel is now a strategic liability rather than an asset, because the United States wants to line up all these countries in the anti-China, Russia, Iran crusade.
Okay, before we continue, maybe it's time to make some announcements. Jean, you go first with oh no, Richard is already there. So Richard, why don't you go ahead make that appeal to funds, and then Jean make the appeal to funds, and then Jean, you can also make your comment afterwards and resume the conversation.
Well, I just want to say about funds. The ICSS still needs some funds for both our operating expenses and to support the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library. I'm not able to post the details on the chat as I usually do, but you can, somebody could do it, or you can find the details on how to do send us money in the email that you received announcing the meeting. If you scroll down, either you can do it through a check or through PayPal, which is the preferred method, or now we do Patreon, and I'm open to other methods if people have those methods too. So give generously. Thank you. And many people have given generously in the past. So back to you, Raj.
Okay, Jean, go ahead, please.
Yes. As everyone knows, next week is the 4th of July. Therefore, we will not have a program on the 4th of July. But please read or listen to the well-known Black speaker on what to a slave is the 4th of July. And you can think about what to a wage slave is the 4th of July. And then we will return the following week, but we're not sure exactly what we're going to be dealing with. We're still working on that. And thank you.
And Grover Fair has agreed to speak on the last Sunday of July. So that's not June, but last Sunday of July. Okay, Yusuf, you're next. So we resume the this discussion among ourselves.
Richard Wright actually
Beg your pardon.
Yeah,
Richard, go ahead. Richard, go next, and then followed by Yusuf and then Norma.
Me? I'm confused.
Your announcement.
Oh, no, I posted, it was, my friend Nan sent me a YouTube thing of the Internationale that was done by Chinese children that I thought was really, it was really appropriate for this particular thing. In celebration of the 100th anniversary of the the Chinese Communist Party. And that's all. I posted the link to it in the chat. That, and she sent a Japanese version as well. But anyways, that's all I had. That's all I was going to do.
Okay. Yusuf, you're next, and then Norma.
I have a few comments on what has been said so far. First, Raj, the PLO unfortunately does not govern the West Bank. It's the so-called Palestine National Authority, or as they now call themselves, the State of Palestine, which is basically Abbas. PLO is a much grander coalition. It includes representatives of diaspora, all the guerrilla resistance organizations. They don't have a say. PLO has been taken out of the picture, and one of the demands of the Palestinians in regards to their internal affairs is that the PLO be revived, because it's a much more democratic and inclusive organization than the way Abbas runs his Palestinian Authority. In regards to Husseini, well, the true patriotic progressive Palestinian leaders were killed in 1936 in the 1936-1937 revolt. Basically, the Palestinian movement was leaderless, and Husseini was the only person left around, and because of his notoriety, many people didn't want to want to dissociate with him. So basically, the Palestinians were leaderless. So he's sort of a boogeyman that's pulled out in this debate, and he's really not that relevant. And also, yeah, I think there's a whole other discussion is that many bourgeois nationalists were, for good reason, found little alternative but to deal with Germany during World War II. I think the IRA might have even had some dealings with Germany. Well, that was because, well, the alternative was for the continuation of colonial rule. I mean, if the British and French had been a little more far-sighted, they would have actually gave a reason for the local nationalists to fight for them. And this happened also in the Spanish Civil War, where the Republican government did not grant independence or self-determination for Morocco, and the result was Franco made a deal with Morocco, and Moroccan troops support them. So those are the two comments I want to make.
Okay, before I go to Norma, I have to give time to Alan because he has not spoken. So Alan, you're next, followed by Norma, followed by Mark Albertson.
Thank you, Raj. First of all, I just wanted to say that the quality of the presentation was outstanding. And I really appreciate the work that you did to bring Norman to the forum and have him participate. I think it was very successful. I also think the quality of the questions was really excellent. I've listened to a lot of YouTube videos of him, and some of them have included questions, and the quality of the questions at the Sunday morning of the Marxist Library are really quite good. So thank you, everybody, for raising such thoughtful and content-rich questions. I wanted to raise a question to the group, make a quick comment. There's a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's been some play on the question of anti-Semitism in the United States coming out of what happened in Gaza. And I would like to get people's comments about what they think about that. I would say very briefly that anti-Semitism has been used as a real battering ram to silence critics of Israel unjustifiably, picking up that theme and using it as an ideological justification for the horrors that the Israelis are perpetrating on not only the Palestinians, but the people in general in the Middle East. That being said, there is still, anti-Semitism in the United States, and in many ways, this use of it this opportunistic use of it by the Zionist establishment, the media, and politicians, in my view, actually contributes to anti-Semitism. Makes people, if you say that the Jews you're attacking the Jews by opposing the massacres in Gaza, then what are you saying about what the Jews represent? So I think that inspires a lot of anti-Semitism. I was wondering what others thought about that.
Okay, so I will go to Norma and then Mark Albertson.
I'm not going to respond to what Alan was saying and asking about. I don't think I've thought about it. So, well, I probably have, but I can't remember. The thing about Gandhi and the passive resistance, strong resistance. it hasn't helped about Cuba very much. Maybe you were aware of the past few days, there's been a lot of organizing and demonstrating in support of ending the blockade, and it's totally ignored by our government. So the passive resistance has not been able to help. We haven't been able to help in many, many situations by our resistance. There's still been slaughter of societies, of nations, of people that just it leaves me gasping. I want to mention that Norman Finkelstein said the word about Hamas, that they hadn't had a chance to rule, and I expect he would have might have intended to mean they hadn't had a chance to govern. The implication of the word rule being very unacceptable, I'd say. It's kind of like all those regimes, all of those that the United States calls regimes, are governments and are not respected, and of course are ignored. In India, this is another thing in line with the Gandhi passive resistance. In India, prior to the change to India owning itself, bands of Indians had been attacking British encampments and taking over them and conquering them and killing the people who were the soldiers there. And that stopped with Gandhi's request for passive behavior demonstrations and so forth, at a cost of 30 years and 8 million lives, extending the occupation that long. This passive resistance.
Incidentally, I just go to Mark, but just quickly, I'm not challenging you, but his term wasn't passive resistance. He called it non-violent resistance.
Right.
There's nothing passive about it. It's very active. Yeah. Okay.
Right. I can never pull down the stuff I need to say. Like what I was talking about was Israel being the promised land. That was the
well, that's the question I posed to him also.
Yeah.
How it didn't succeed with Hitler because Gandhi had this same thing. Okay. So it didn't work there. Why do you think it'll work here? Anyway, Mark, you're next. And
thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Mark, go
ahead. Norma, I put on the chat a book written on Husseini. So if you ever want access to it, the other side of the coin, just a real quick trivia piece about Husseini. Husseini, believe it or not, helped to form an SS division for Himmler in World War II. It was the 13th Waffen SS Gebirgsdivision and wound up being a mountain division. Get this, they were Croatians of ethnic German Croatians and Muslims. And they are the only SS division. You see the Shriners where they wear those cone-shaped hats. It's the only SS division that were running around with cone-shaped hats on. The division later fell apart because the Muslims and Christians couldn't get along. But Husseini helped to put this together. But how do you think they were treating some of the Christians and communists, fighting with Tito in Yugoslavia?
So I'm talking about when I was about 30 years old, and now I'm 86 and just finding out about Husseini. I'm very slow.
He's an interesting character, Norma.
I believe it.
He's an interesting character.
I believe it.
Norma, I want to be like you when I grow up. Who's next? Anybody who wants to go next?
I just wanted to say real quick to Mark, I think you said you posted it in the chat. I think you sent it to me.
Oh, I did?
Yeah. I sent you an email or I sent you a chat.
I haven't seen that. I was looking for
it.
You
might want to resend it to everyone.
Yeah.
Good. That's good. I forget those regularly to change everyone.
Yeah, if you want to stop early today, I'm fine with it. It's 12:22. We still have time until 1. I won't be here after 12:30 today because
Yeah, we can wrap it up.
Oh, I want to fetch a thing.
Okay.
Somebody that I got an email from or whatever it was, saw in the newspaper, was talking about having to fight back against the Chinese communist attack. A Chinese communist attack. It is deplorable what's going on out there.
Okay. So I'm going to stop recording at this point.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com. And the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.